Thanks for your patience, colleagues. So we'll go to Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. While I have the floor, I'd like to move a motion which I have put on notice as of Friday, January the 26th. And this motion is as follows. Given that A, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, CIB, recently admitted that it lost nearly $900,000 in consulting fees on the failed Lake Erie Connector project. B, the Liberal government has refused to implement this committee's recommendation to abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank, that the committee conduct a study pursuant to Standing Order 1082 of the CIB's involvement in the Lake Erie Connector project, that the study be comprised of no fewer than 3 meetings, that the committee invite the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, the Chief Executive Officer of the CIB, the Chief Investment Officer of the CIB, and the Chief Financial Officer of the CIB to appear as witnesses for no less than 2 hours each, and that the committee report its findings to the House. Mr. Chair, I'd like to comment on this motion briefly, if I may. It was recently revealed through an order paper that the Canada Infrastructure Bank lost $900,000 on a failed electricity project, that the opposition members had big concerns about from the very, very beginning that this project was announced. There were concerns from when government first announced the project, and these concerns were voiced by members of the opposition. The government announced an investment of $655 million in an underwater electricity project, which had it been viable, it would have actually brought jobs and investment to my community of Haldimand, Norfolk. They promised billions in GDP from this project and hundreds of jobs and low-cost energy in the low-cost energy sector. But ironically, due to interest rates and inflation, which was largely caused by this government's overspending, the project was indefinitely suspended. Now, no one seems to have known at the time that the project was canceled until the Conservatives demanded answers from the government, which was several months after the project was canceled. And even then, we couldn't find any information about the project. And we couldn't find information not even on the Canada Infrastructure Bank's website. Now we find out through a written request for information that Canadian taxpayers paid a lot of money for high-priced consultants and lawyers, and that this project was suspended. Canadian taxpayers reaped absolutely zero benefit from this project, despite spending a substantial amount on consultants and lawyers. As you know, this committee's recommended in 2022, in the report of 2022, that this CIB be abolished. Meanwhile, Canadians continue to see the inappropriate use of taxpayer-funded dollars by this bank, including the ones that we're discussing today here in committee. We also heard in this committee of the Infrastructure Bank's close connections to McKinsey and Company and its problematic over-reliance on external consultants. I believe that increased scrutiny and a timely investigation into this matter is needed to ensure that the bank is not continuing on a path of ill-advised investment and spending on high-priced consultants and lawyers at a time when Canadians can least afford it, and many Canadians are finding themselves relying on food banks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. I believe that Mr. Badaway, you wanted to speak to Dr. Lewis's motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would like to speak on it, and I do want to speak on it on a high level, and then I'll get a bit more granular on the motion itself. Mr. Chair, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is, and I think we all, at least on this side of the table, understand is an innovative approach to get more infrastructure built for Canadians, while leveraging funds with all sectors throughout the Canadian economy to, in fact, in terms of the overall project costs, save Canadian taxpayers dollars by including other partners as leverage partners to get projects off the ground, then therefore having them built and to the benefit of Canadians, but at a lesser cost because of the leverage funding that's being made available from all those sectors. By leveraging public dollars, the bank has attracted, and this is fact, the bank has attracted over $10 billion and enabled $28 billion worth of infrastructure projects across the country that would otherwise not have been gone forward. Some of these include the purchase of approximately 280 electric zero-emission buses and associated charging infrastructure over the next 5 years in British Columbia, the procurement of up to 450 zero-emission buses to replace the City of Brampton's current fleet, and better internet connectivity for almost 200,000 households in underserviced Ontario communities, quite frankly, in an adjacent community of mine, and ironically, in the community that Ms. Lewis represents. Canadians can be rest assured that every public dollar spent on infrastructure is creating jobs. It's unlocking the housing Canadians need, and it fights climate change and building the economy of the future. I can speak a lot more to this, Mr. Chair, but I am going to get a bit more granular on the background of what Ms. Lewis is referring to in her motion. The proponents made the decision not to move ahead with the proposed project in July of 2022 as the project's economics had significantly deteriorated according to their business expectations, their business plan expectations in comparison to what the reality was back in 2022. No funding agreement was completed between the proponents and the CIB. Expenses for legal and technical consultants are a normal part of the due diligence required for all projects to proceed towards an investment stage. Mr. Chairman, expenses are budgeted annually as part of the CIB's commitment to good governance, which, quite frankly, was established by the members in accordance to what was put before them when the creation of the CIB was put in place. The due diligence completed will be valuable should the proponents decide to restart the project. Mr. Chair, and I do want to give some project description so we can put perspective to the comments that were made by Ms. Lewis. The Lake Erie Connector project is a proposed 1,000 megawatt underwater transmission line connecting converter stations located in Nanticoke, Ontario, and Erie, Pennsylvania. The 117-kilometer high-voltage direct current connection was designed to help improve the reliability and security of Ontario's energy grid while significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions between both power markets. Benefits of the CIB involvement is the participation of the CIB, which was structured to enhance the project's viability, improve taxpayer value, and provide benefits to all electricity consumers in Ontario. Once again, Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to leveraging dollars, less of an impact, saving the Canadian taxpayers those very capital dollars. The CIB's participation was designed to address a potential funding gap in the project by providing low-cost financing to reduce revenue needs while satisfying all project development requirements. Mr. Chair, once again, and I do want to repeat what I said in camera, and I'll say it in public. The concept and the business model of the CIB is simply to leverage dollars from all sectors within the Canadian economy. That being said, and that being completed, as I mentioned earlier with this specific project and the many more I highlighted, it then does two things. It lessens the overall impact, the financial impact on Canadian taxpayers. That $1 then turns into $3 to $4, which would otherwise come out of the pockets of Canadian taxpayers, but the funding is being leveraged to come in from other sectors throughout the Canadian economy. And secondly, and probably most importantly, is the capital work gets done in the best interests of what's needed here in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Strahl.
Very much, Mr. Chair, and I think I'm obviously supportive of Dr. Lewis's motion. I think the committee should adopt it as a study to see what happened in this case. It might have been well-intentioned, and the project, had it been completed, may have served Canadians well, but the fact is, in this case, it was not completed. So it did not improve taxpayer value, as Mr. Badaway said. It didn't save dollars. It actually resulted in an expenditure of dollars, nearly $1 million on consultants, that essentially now is in a project that has not gone forward. So $1 million in taxpayer money was spent on a project that has been suspended or canceled. And so that is what we need to investigate. How did that happen? How do we make sure that it doesn't happen again? So I think we should vote to approve Dr. Lewis's motion so that this can be a future study for this committee. Thank you.
Okay, we will go to a vote.
Mr. Chair, before we go to a vote, I'm trying to work on an amendment here. So,
Point of order? No, I know. Just to be clear,
So I have first, if I'm going in order, it would be Barclay Duval, suivi par Mr. Bachrach, suivi par Mr. Badaway, suivi par...
And Mr. Bachrach, Mr. Badaway, and then Dr. Lewis, and then Mr. Iacono.
and
then,
when the speakers list is exhausted, we vote.
then when there's no more discussion,
you're going to go to a vote
we're going to go to a vote.
in open session.
Yeah,
Good.
so let's go.
This guy.
Exactly.
Mr. Chair.
So we have Mr. Barclay
Thank you, Mr.
Duval, suivi par Mr. Bachrach.
Mr. Barclay Duval and Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Barclay Duval, please. Thank you, Chair. So I understand the intent of my colleague on the other side, Mr. Badaway, to defend the existence of the bank and the work that it's accomplished and all that. And he can do so. It's quite legitimate to do so. And I also understand what the Conservative colleague, Ms. Lewis, wants to do, to delve into the file of the Lake Erie Connector file that is said to have cost $900,000, nearly $1 million in consulting fees before the project didn't take place, if we understand correctly. So people wonder why so much money was spent on a project that ended up not taking place. People say $900,000 on consulting fees for a project is a huge amount. I understand the idea also for the committee to want to ask questions and ask for more information on that. But what I would have liked to see would have been to see the contracts. That's what I would have been interested in seeing, to be able to evaluate that and get an explanation of why that money was spent, whether it was well spent or not. I have the impression that we're skipping steps, that people want to do politics. And right now, if we're in a public meeting rather than in camera to study a report, it's with the idea of doing politics, but I want to be constructive. So if we want to try to gain something constructive out of it, that would be that, to ask to obtain a copy of the contracts, to meet with the people from the bank who managed that file, to have them come and explain to us how the money was spent, and to demonstrate that it was well spent, because clearly it could seem worrisome for everyday Canadians. So I'm going to stop there, but I think that the motion before us right now could be reworked so that the objective is not just to put on a show, but really to try to obtain results for our fellow citizens who are our taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Barclay Duval. I have Mr. Bachrach and then Mr. Iacono, Dr. Lewis, and Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague for bringing forward this motion. This is a topic that I think my colleagues know is of interest to us as well, perhaps for slightly different reasons. And I appreciate, understanding whether Canadian citizens got value for the $900,000 that was spent doing due diligence is a worthy topic for the committee to investigate. We also have questions, though, about the validity of the original assumptions. In particular, the idea that this project was going to be an opportunity for Ontario to export clean power to the United States, resulting in a net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I think there have been some questions asked about whether that was going to be the case. And it would be very interesting to better understand what those initial assumptions were, what those assumptions were based on, and why the CIB felt like that this was going to be an advantageous project from the perspective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I will note that the CIB was considering investing $600 million in this project, a private sector project put forward by a huge corporation with very deep pockets that could very easily finance their own project. So I think it was one of our Conservative colleagues who used to sit on this committee who said that instead of crowding investment into public sector infrastructure projects, which was the original stated goal of the CIB, this project looked like crowding public sector investment into private sector projects. And so understanding the rationale behind that and what the thinking of the people behind the CIB was is very much, I believe, in the public interest and will help inform this committee's understanding of how this all took place. I am a little bit concerned about the time allocated to each of the 4 witnesses listed. If we're having a 3-meeting study and we allocate 2 hours to each of the 4 witnesses, that's a pretty substantial chunk of time. I want to ensure that there's enough testimony remaining to hear from other witnesses that can provide insights on the aspects that I've mentioned. I know that often witnesses appear on a panel. If we could have a panel of 4 witnesses and perhaps allocate one of the 3 meetings to hearing from the CIB officials, that would be a fair allocation, or 1.5. But I do think that there are other witnesses that would be good to hear from when it comes to understanding the project itself, not just the investment of the $900,000 to do due diligence. So I'll leave my remarks at that. This is something that we support. I think folks around the table know that. And I would certainly look forward to this being, a study of the committee. And we have a tradition at the committee of taking turns in proposing studies. So this is one of the more cordial committees that I've had a chance to sit on. And I think we want to continue that tradition. So if this is the Conservatives' offering in terms of a study for this committee, I certainly support that.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I have Dr. Lewis, followed by Mr. Badaway.
Most of my comments were covered by Mr. Bachrach and Mr. Strahl. However, I do want to highlight that there has been a continuous problem of wasting money on consultants, and the taxpayers have very deep concerns about this. And given that $900,000 was spent on consultants with no viable project, I think it's incumbent on sitting members to recognize the concerns that taxpayers would have with this, and also to call for transparency. This information was not revealed until an order paper was submitted in order to find out details. It was not posted on the CIB's website. And so it's very important that taxpayers have a right to hear about this instrument of the CIB, whereby we are giving low-cost interest rates when the average taxpayer is sometimes paying 8 to 10% on their mortgage and is struggling. And we have 2 million people going to food banks every month. The issue of transparency is very, very important to see what happened with this $900,000, to ensure that this does not happen again in the future, and to ensure that there's respect for taxpayers' dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Badaway, followed by Mr. Strahl. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things. To some extent, I look forward to this because it will really clear up a lot of misconceptions that may in fact exist, especially with those across the table, in particular as it relates to the dollars that the CIB is actually managing, whether it come from government or whether it come from the private sector. And I think when that reality is recognized, it may surprise a lot of people. I guess the second part of it, Mr. Chair, if I can ask for your indulgence, is if we can suspend for a few minutes so that I can work on these amendments I spoke about earlier and possibly bring some amendments forward based on discussion with my colleagues on this side of the table. So I'm asking for a suspension for a few minutes. That's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow for members to consult with each other and prepare amendments. The meeting is now suspended. Mr. Badaway, I guess I'll turn it over to you to speak to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And right now, at this point in time, what I would want to speak on is what was reported in the second quarter as a preface to my amendment. When we look at the second quarter results for the fiscal year 2023-2024, since the inception of the CIB, and I want to be clear on this, investment commitments of $10.1 billion to projects valued at nearly $28.9 billion is currently on the books. At the end of the second quarter, the CIB portfolio included 51 investments, Mr. Chairman, 51 commitments, I should say, 45 of which have reached the financial close milestone. These are all loans, Mr. Chairman, that will be repaid and reinvested into more infrastructure in the future. I just want to give a few more examples, Mr. Chair, if I may. The Durham Region zero-emission buses, $62 million. The Durham Region towards 98 zero-emission buses. And, of course, will in fact reduce GHGs by 6,525 tons per year. Here, Mr. Chairman, in the city of Ottawa, zero-emission buses, the electrification of vehicles is the key to the city of Ottawa's goal of reducing greenhouse gases, GHGs, emissions by 100% by 2040, and this actually invests in that direction that the city has taken, and as well, Mr. Chairman, demonstrates the city's commitment to lead by example. When we look at the autobus, again, zero-emission school buses is another example, and as well, electric buses contribute to Quebec's objective of electrifying 65% of its school bus fleet by 2030, while providing high-quality transit services for students. This, Mr. Chairman, will remove 2,146 tons of greenhouse gas emissions and supporting up to 131 buses. Mr. Chairman, I'll say this, we look at and we speak about the affordability issues that Canadians have throughout the country, and what we as a government are attempting to do to ease that pain when it comes to affordability. And this is a mechanism, this is a lever, which is quite frankly being good at the business of government versus attempting to be good at the business of politics, which we see a lot of in the House, unfortunately, and sometimes at committee. But when we look at the business of government and we look at what we're attempting to do to leverage funds to then therefore alleviate the pressure, the financial pressure on Canadians while moving forward with the direction that we've brought forward, whether it be through climate change, whether it be through updating our infrastructure, whether it be working with municipalities that, quite frankly, are in infrastructure deficits. And when a municipality is in an infrastructure deficit, they find themselves then relying on the property taxpayer or the water bills. And this gives them a lot of opportunity to once again leverage funding to then therefore, again, and I'll say it, underline it and bold it, alleviate the financial burden on Canadian taxpayers, whether it be from this federal level or whether it be at the municipal level with respect to property taxes and water bills. Mr. Chairman, when we look at owner-operators of properties, primarily in Western Canada's prairie provinces, many retrofits of approximately 95 properties will be represented. And this, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, represents 240 buildings. Just another example. Facilitating energy efficient at scale in the multi-unit residential sector, once again, housing that aligns with responsible building, especially as it relates to climate change. Optimizing energy performance in more than 6,400 residences, significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions by approximately 50%. So, Mr. Chair, I welcome the motion. I really do, so that I can go on at quite frankly nauseam with respect to the examples of what these investments are supporting. But I once again do want to highlight for those watching of what the intent and the business plan of the CIB in fact is. Quite frankly, it doesn't go against a lot of the intents that former governments had, regardless of what party they may belong to, with respect to attempting to leverage those dollars to therefore alleviate the financial burden on Canadian taxpayers. The difference being is that this is actually doing it. And yes, there's ups and downs. That's business. But when we look at ultimately the bottom line, there's a benefit when you see what's being invested, leveraged, and then secondly, what's in fact being built. And with that said, one of the interests that I have as we move forward with this study, possibly, and we hear from the partners, whether it be from government or whether it be from the private sector, I guess I'll add this, is that when the CIB was created, it was created to be at arm's length from government. That in fact, we take the experience that was made up of the actual panel, the board, and I have to add that that experience that they brought to the table as part of reports with respect to members of the Advisory Council on Economic Growth. These are folks that are well experienced in business. These are folks that are well experienced in leveraging funding from all Canadian sectors. And these are folks that are experienced at getting the job done. And when we as government put forward initiatives, especially as it relates to capital investments to not only build new, but also manage the assets that we currently have, we want to do so in an expeditious manner. But most importantly, we want to do so without the financial burden being placed on the property or the Canadian taxpayer at all levels of government, whether it be the the federal, whether it be the provincial, or equally as important, the municipal, as it relates to property taxes and water bills, in particular on the water bills, the capital fixed rates, which those consumers can't control with respect to their individual water bills. That's what this is intended to do. And yes, we're making gains, but it's going to make more gains. And what's expected is that those gains will be made well into the future as we leverage more money and the private sector gets more involved in those capital investments as is needed throughout the country. So with that, Mr. Chair, what I would be interested in, and as I said earlier, the CIB has the mandate to move forward utilizing that experience that I mentioned earlier, based or contained within the Advisory Council on Economic Growth. And with that, again, being at arm's length away from the government. And I noticed in the recommendation that Ms. Lewis puts forward, it actually asks for the meetings and asks for representation from the government to be present at these meetings. I don't think that's appropriate. I think, quite frankly, with government being at arm's length away, that in fact we can proceed simply utilizing the representation from the CIBC or CIBC, the CIB itself. That's what we're drilling down to on this particular project. Is the reasons why, how, what, and intentions. And I think for the most part, that would be appropriate to receive that representation, therefore then to receive the answers that we're expecting on this particular project. And that's the one amendment I'll start off with, is by removing that and just proceeding with those folks that are actually in the game, those folks that are actually making the decisions, and those folks that actually were a part of this specific project. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Do we have that submitted, that amendment? Do we have anything submitted? Have you submitted anything, Mr. Badaway, or is it just verbal? Okay, it's verbal. Do we need to then get that down and then get it translated and circulated, or? Okay, so I guess I'll turn it over to the committee. Do we want a written form of that, or are we okay with what Mr. Badaway had said? And I'll turn it over to Mr. Strahl.
Just to clarify, is Mr. Badaway suggesting that the minister responsible for the Canada Infrastructure Bank not be invited to come and speak about this Canada Infrastructure Bank issue? Is it just a deletion of? Does he want to prevent the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities from appearing at this committee? Is that, if that's what we're talking about, that's a very simple deletion, and we can talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think with the minimal meetings that we're actually allowing for this study, I think we have to concentrate on what the intent of the study or the study is by Ms. Lewis. And I think most of that, again, taking into consideration the limited time that we have and those members that we're going to expect to attend to give us those answers, that in fact we stick with those members first. Now, having said that, there's no question that as we're moving forward in those meetings, if in fact the minister then is required to come out and clarify and or be a part of something that has to do with the government, because I want to emphasize this once again. There's arm's length. It's no different than VIA. It's no different than CN. There's no different than the CTA. There's organizations that were created that are separate from government. And I know what the intent of the opposition is bringing in the politics of it. I get that, and that's what they do, and that's what there's to do. I get that part of the game. But I'm more interested in getting down more granular into the business side of it, in terms of if there's a concern on this specific project, let's get to it. And the only way we can get to it is if we're going to deal with the people, and we're going to ask questions of the people, and we're going to hear from those individuals that are in fact those that are intimately involved with not only the CIB, but again, getting a bit more granular, this specific project within the CIB. Now, once again, and I apologize for being repetitive, but if then we recognize through the dialogue and through the testimony that is provided to us by those that are involved in this specific project, that the minister would then be needed to come out, we can make that request at that time. But I don't think it's appropriate, being an arm's length organization, that we ask that to happen at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Bachrach.
Mr. Chair, before I say my piece, it sounded like there was some discussion between Mr. Badaway and Mr. Strahl about whether or not the minister's appearance would be included in the motion. And I'm just looking to Mr. Badaway and Mr. Strahl as to whether an amendment might be coming forward from either of them, in which case I would allow that to take place, and I'm happy to provide my thoughts on that. And I would speak afterwards in the order. It seems like there's a side or a track of discussion here that my remarks don't relate to, and so I'm happy to postpone my intervention until we've worked that out.
Is there any clarification from Mr. Strahl or Mr. Badaway? Mr. Badaway?
Well, I think Mr. Strahl is very clear, and I think my response is clear, but to help Mr. Bachrach along, again, I will be repetitive, is to delete from the motion any representation from the government, and that if it's specific to the minister, then it would delete that part of the motion. And then, of course, my caveat to that is that essentially, and the reasoning behind the deletion is that, once again, the government is at arm's length from the CIB, period. That's the way it was set up. I understand that the terms of reference and the creation of the CIB was, in fact, by the government, with the intention, as I said earlier, to accelerate capital work that needs to be done, and as well, while accelerating that, to lessen the financial burden on property taxpayers by leveraging funds from different sectors of our Canadian economy. Having said that, while we then enter the dialogue, as Ms. Lewis intends to do, with those that are involved in a specific project. Now, although I do believe there's going to be a lot more coming out in a testimony of the purpose of the CIB, but in terms of zeroing in on a specific project, I think it's imperative that we listen to the people that are directly involved with this specific project as part of this arm's length organization, the CIB. And therefore, yes, there may be a time within that dialogue and a testimony that's provided to us that the minister might be asked to come out and clarify maybe a clarity to the structure, a clarity to the terms of reference. I get that. But more than likely that won't happen because the project was discussed, the project was agreed upon by the CIB, not the minister, not the government of Canada, by the CIB. So I just think it's premature right now to ask the minister to come out and involve him or herself, in this case him, in a dialogue that, quite frankly, they were no part of. And with that said, I think it's more productive on our time, especially with the limited time that we're going to have with this study, to really zero in, as Ms. Lewis's intention is, I'm sure. And I don't want to speak for her, but I'm assuming, based on the motion that was presented to us, that her intention is to zero in on not only the complexities, but her perceived challenges the project has had And if those challenges are then brought forward by those that are involved in the project, then quite frankly, we need to hear that. We don't need to waste time to play politics on this. We want to get down to the business of it, and those people that can give us that are the people that are involved in it, though, hence the CIB invitations, and then we can move from there. And again, I want to be repetitive, and then if the minister is then needed to clarify some of those governance issues or terms of reference issues or issues with respect to the setting up of the CIB, then of course we can invite the minister at that time. But right now, I don't think it's relevant. I think if we're going to get down to the project, we have to be dealing with the people that we're actually dealing with that specific project.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Bachrach, suivi par Monsieur Barcel-Duval.
Just as a point of clarification, Mr. Chair,
My name is
did
Russell Duval.
Badaway move an amendment to the motion? I was having difficulty understanding. And could you read the amendment?
Sure, I'll ask, I guess, the analyst or the clerk to do it. I asked whether or not we needed an actual distribution of it, but apparently it's just eliminating a portion of the paragraph. So I'll ask the clerk to read that out for everyone's benefit.
So I won't read back the preamble, but the core of the motion is the committee conduct a study pursuant to the Standing Order 1082 on the Canada Infrastructure Bank involvement in the Lake Erie Connector project, that the study be comprised of no fewer than 3 meetings, that the committee invite the Chief Executive Officer of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Chief Investment Officer of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and the Chief Financial Officer of the Canada Infrastructure Bank to appear as a witness for no less than 2 hours each, that the committee reports its findings to the House.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Were you done with your intervention?
My intervention does not deal with the amendment that is now on the floor. So if I can stay in the speaking order and allow this to go to a vote, then I'd like to speak after we're done on the main motion.
Duly noted. I'll make sure that you're up next after we deal with this amendment. Monsieur Barcel-Duval.
Mr. Barcel-Duval. Thank you, Chair. I understand partly why the Liberals want to bring out the minister from the study proposed by the Conservatives. I understand that there's a will to protect the minister and also a desire to assert or reaffirm that the infrastructure bank is operating at arm's length from the government. I think they've repeated that often enough that we understand that it's a point they consider important. However, I think that the focus or their understanding, perhaps they don't fully understand the motion that is on the table, because perhaps they're focusing on the preamble rather than on the motion itself. And in the preamble, it refers to the $900,000 of fees that were spent by the infrastructure bank, not far from $1 million. So I suppose that it's not the minister who granted the $1 million. I presume it's not the minister who decided to whom the contracts would go, as the bank operated at arm's length from the government. So at this stage, I don't think we've reached the point of blaming the minister. Not at this stage. We don't know what will follow. But I think at this stage, we need to know how the funds were spent and, of course, the justifications. But the motion per se does not refer specifically to the $900,000, but rather all of it. It talks about a study on the participation of the CIB on the Lake Erie Connection project. So it's broader than just the $900,000 of the contract. It focuses on the Lake Erie Connector project itself. And the question that comes to mind is, why wouldn't the minister come and talk to us about it? Because actually, starting when is a minister made aware that a project is coming or that the CIB is working on a project? How aware is the minister of this project, for example? Did the minister authorize certain things, or as of when do things have to be authorized by the minister? I think there are a lot of questions, and we would like to know, for the benefit of the committee members and for the benefit of people who are going to be watching us, to better understand the interactions between the infrastructure bank and those projects that is conducting and the minister, so that we can understand to what extent this arm's length distance exists or not. So to my mind, having the minister participate would be beneficial for a study like this. Is it essential at this stage? Is it the most pressing point in the motion? Perhaps not. but I think there is added value certainly in having the minister appear for the study. That is why the amendment that is proposed by Mr. I don't support it.
Mr. Chair, we're talking about Minister Sean Fraser here. He's not afraid to speak. He speaks quite well, and I think he would come and provide value. I have no doubt he would provide value to the public and to this committee to talk about. Well, he can make the case that others want to make on the other side. He can explain why he had nothing to do with it. He can explain how there was $1 million can go into a project that doesn't get completed, and how what he's doing to make sure that doesn't happen again, because there is, of course, accountability to the public. The public has no accountability mechanism other than through the minister and Parliament for the decisions of the CIB. So they want to be arm's length, but they are spending tax dollars. And the way that the public and parliamentarians, the only access that we have to that accountability is through the minister. And that's the entire way this is set up. That's why he is the minister responsible for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So I don't think Minister Fraser will be intimidated by this committee. He won't be afraid to come. He doesn't need to be protected and taken off of this list. He can come and explain how this has been set up, and as well, the Part B of the motion refers once again to the fact that the government has refused to accept the recommendation of this committee to abolish the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So there are two parts of this. One is, why did $1 million get wasted and the project didn't go ahead? And the second is, why aren't you listening to this parliamentary committee that has recommended that the CIB be abolished? So Minister Fraser should be invited. We can talk about the number of hours he should speak or be available to us. We can talk about the composition of the panels that he comes with, what order he comes in. If he wants to come if he wants to come first, he wants to come last. We're open to those discussions, but to suggest that the minister responsible for the Canada Infrastructure Bank does not have a role to play or doesn't have anything to offer this committee when we're talking about Canada Infrastructure Bank expenditures, I think is simply the government protecting their minister from having to answer those questions. He's responsible for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. That is extremely clear. That is part of the mandate. If you look at the CIB's website, there will be a picture of Sean Fraser on the front page. So let's not pretend that he has nothing to answer for here. So we can, that would be a decision of this committee, but it would not be based on what is right or what is proper. It would be a political decision. So we think he can come and answer our questions and defend the $1 million that went to a project that didn't get built. And then he can defend why the government insists on keeping the Canada Infrastructure Bank against the advice of this very committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stroll. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank members of the committee for their interventions. And I want to be clear that my intervention isn't to protect anybody. My intervention is just to make time productive, because we have a great deal of reports that all parties have put forward that are in the queue right now. We only have so many sessions before we rise in for the summer to get those reports completed. Reports, by the way, that are very important to Canadians in all parts. The Northern Airline Report in rural communities, as well as our study, I should say, as well as other studies, and of course, following that, reports that we want to bring to the House. So I'm just trying to make best do with the time that we have available to us. And therefore, let's do it in a very strategic manner and constructive manner, dealing with the business of government versus the business of politics. Having said that, And going back to my comment of earlier, it's not my intent to protect anybody. Mr. Fraser has full ability to stand on his own 2 feet with a great deal of strength. I think we've noticed that in the House, and we've noticed that at committee. Sean's not only a great part of the Liberal team, but he's a great part of Parliament team. And you know, his intentions are all genuine, and we all appreciate that. So to have him involved in this at some point, I would welcome. I just thought it would be best that we actually take it in a more layered approach with respect to what the intentions, I'm sure, are of Ms. Lewis. Having said that, and again, I'll state the fact of this, because I'm going to have a further amendment after my comments to this point, is that, Mr. Chairman, you know, let's not dismiss the history of leveraging, the history of utilizing other partners to invest in capital projects throughout the country. You know, our colleagues, for example, the Conservatives across the way, had 10 years to do something on infrastructure. And how many projects did P3 Canada work on? I think that's what the title of it was then, P3 Canada, not the Canada Infrastructure Bank, but they called it P3 Canada. It worked on 25 projects with $1.3 billion. Let us compare that to just under 5 years with the Canada Infrastructure Bank with 48 projects. And by the way, let me go back to that 1.3 billion and the Conservatives invested in 10 years. That they invested in 10 years. That was all taxpayer-funded money, all from Canadians. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, in under 5 years, had 48 projects and $10 billion investment from the government. And do we know what that turned into? It turned into $28 billion in investment. That's the intent, Mr. Chairman, of this. That's the intent and the meaning behind leveraging, once again, alleviating the financial burden on taxpayers, Canadian taxpayers, at all levels of government, and secondly, accelerating the capital projects that this country so needs. We heard at committee that investments such as the transfer has been transformational, Mr. Chairman, these investments. And in fact, I want to quote something we heard from a witness that we had at the committee as she spoke about this on her own podcast called The Rate Stuff on infrastructure deficit, the role of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. This was on January 30th. And who said this? It was the Honorable Lisa Raitt, a former Conservative minister. And she was talking about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And she said, and I quote, Mr. Chairman, "Unfortunately, the bank has been the topic of a lot of political discussion in the past number of years. It was not supported by the Conservative Party at various times in the last Parliament, and in this Parliament as well. However, you're doing a lot of work. You're getting a lot of projects done, and you are, I think, filling a need that has been shown to be necessary in order to get projects going here in Canada. So tell me, what is going on in 2023 for the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the projects that you are doing to be looking at, or you're going to be looking at? Conservative former ministers do not even support the Conservative position on this. As most Canadians know, Conservative math just doesn't add up. They're reckless. They spent more taxpayer money to get fewer projects done in double the amount of time. And this is the Conservative math for us. I'm going to talk about some of these projects that I have heard members here today refer to as slush funds. I find that pretty interesting. They said that only Liberal insiders are getting rich from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But I want to speak about a project in Alberta, the Aero Technology Group, an $8.1 million investment. This is building broadband in underserviced communities. These communities in dire need of broadband services, including 20 Indigenous and 4 rural communities. Are the Conservatives suggesting that these underserviced Indigenous communities are rich Liberal insiders benefiting from this bank? Or is it that they just can't wrap their heads around how to actually build the infrastructure that matters? And once again, Mr. Chairman, I want to emphasize mitigating the financial burden on Canadian taxpayers by leveraging those dollars. It ensures that for example, as I mentioned, that what matters to Canadians is being invested in. Indigenous communities and rural communities, it ensures that they are connected so they have the ability to stay connected with loved ones and to create economic prosperity in these communities. Mr. Chairman, it's building infrastructure. It's building Canada. The fact that the Conservatives would insult Indigenous and rural communities in Alberta by calling
You
this
can
somehow...
indeed. My apologies, Mr. Badaway. I have a point of order from
And
Mr. Backrack.
My apologies to Mr. Badaway for cutting off his train of thought or his reading. Prior to this, I had, I think, very graciously tried to allow the discussion about whether the minister should appear to finish up so that we could vote on the amendment and go back to the original motion. It feels to me like Mr. Badaway is now reading stuff that applies more to the larger motion than to the amendment. And if I can just, I understand that he has the floor and he can do with it what he will, but if I could express my frustration that I was in the speaking list, I would like to speak before the end of the meeting to the main motion. And I'm concerned that we're not moving towards a vote on the amendment. So if we can either restore the original speakers list or move to a vote on the amendment, I'd appreciate it. And you can do with that what you will as chair, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Backrack. I have indication from Mr. Badaway that he's going to wrap up soon. Yeah, and you have a point of order, Mr. Strahl?
I do, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear that we are not prepared to give, we don't have our implied consent to adjourn the meeting at 1 o'clock. We'd like to deal with this matter, so we're prepared to continue to debate this motion going forward. So just wanted to let you know that we're not expecting the gavel to come down at 1.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Floor is yours, Mr. Badaway.
Well, I guess that's presumptuous, but we'll deal with that when that motion comes to the floor. As I was stating, Mr. Chair, it matters for Canadians, as I was mentioning earlier, in particular Indigenous communities and rural communities. These investments ensure that they're connected, especially with broadband, so that they have the ability to stay connected throughout the country. The fact that the Conservatives would insult Indigenous and rural communities in Alberta by calling this somehow a slush fund, as was in past testimony, is somewhat, quite frankly, deplorable. And I guess in closing, Mr. Chair, let us talk about Saskatoon and the $27.3 million to the English River First Nation project for wastewater treatment. This will be the first Indigenous-owned wastewater treatment plant, and as more is being invested in Saskatoon and Saskatchewan, will be recognized throughout the CIB. And is that more Liberal insiders getting rich? I don't think so. Or is it real investment for Indigenous communities so that they have economic development within their communities and they can ensure that they have, in fact, clean water? The development of wastewater treatment plants allows for economic development and growth in Saskatoon. And are the Conservatives suggesting that the jobs created from this infrastructure investment should be lost and that those families should be sent pink slips because Conservatives want to cancel these projects? There are shovels in the ground, Mr. Chairman, and we're moving forward with needed investment around this country. But again, to do so, accelerate that investment by not putting financial burden on taxpayers. There are jobs in communities happening right now, and Conservatives would see those employees fired as those shovel-ready projects are underway. It is completely reckless to destroy local economies and prevent local families from being able to provide for themselves because of Conservative ideology. The Conservatives do not believe that they should be helping to build Canada, but they want to tear it down. So, Mr. Chairman, after all that said, and the desire by the Conservatives and others across the floor to include the minister, and what I had mentioned with respect to the history of, I'll use the word, a structure. As in the past, the Conservative structure, the P3 Canada, and of course the structure that we've brought forward with CIB and Canada Infrastructure Bank. Same concept. Obviously this one being more productive. But if we're going to involve the minister, Mr. Chairman, that's fine. Let's get him out. Let's have that discussion. Hopefully that'll satisfy the opposition and opposition members on all sides. But I would like to put a motion forward or an amendment forward that if that's going to carry, or if that's going to be the intent of the opposition, that we also include as a witness the former minister, the Honorable Lisa Raitt, as being part of that witness list. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Backrack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Badaway had indicated he had an amendment, but I guess we're sort of speaking more broadly to this topic. There's an amendment on the floor to remove the minister's appearance from the list of witnesses. I wanted to speak to the larger issue, and I'll do so now with your indulgence. And I think this might shed light on why the minister's appearance would be appropriate, and also on some of the topics that I mentioned earlier in terms of why this is a matter of interest to me and to our party. And I'll just read from this article by Paul Wells that appeared in The Logic on March 21st, 2022. And I found this very interesting, especially the last part, which I think the committee will also find interesting. So he begins, follow the Trudeau government long enough and you start to learn that their announcements are a shaky guide to their actions. Sometimes they do what they say they will. Other times it's more complicated. It's often, I'll try not to insert my own opinions along the way, and I'll just read this excerpt. It's often handy to wait a while after an announcement and then check back in with two questions. Have they really done it? And should they really do it? Case in point, in April of 2021, the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced an agreement in principle to invest up to $655 million in the Lake Erie Connector, a 117-kilometer underwater transmission line to move electric power between Ontario and the Pennsylvania hub of PJM Interconnection, a 13-state U.S. energy consortium. 11 months after its initial announcement, the Canada Infrastructure Bank's board still has not approved, and this was at the time of writing, its $655 million investment in the Lake Erie Connector, and no money has flowed to the project, while Ontario's Conservative government is asking hard questions about the impact it could have on greenhouse gas emissions in the province. The Canada Infrastructure Bank's investment will, and this is a quote, the Canada Infrastructure Bank's investment will give Ontario direct access to North America's largest electricity market, Catherine McKenna, who was then the infrastructure minister, said in the bank's news release. Aaron Corey, the Infrastructure Bank CEO, was effusive. Quote, this project will allow Ontario to export its clean, non-emitting power to one of the largest power markets in the world, and as a result, benefit Canadians economically while also significantly contributing to greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the PJM market, unquote, he said in the bank's news release. This is a true win-win for both Canada and the US, both economically and environmentally. It all had an impressive air of certainty about it. There was no hint of doubt in the Globe and Mail's coverage of the announcement. The paper's story said the power line's proponent, Michigan-based ITC Holdings, had all the necessary permits and could start construction before 2021 ended. And indeed, the bank's news release contained 13 uses of the word will, so it was possible to overlook the note of conditionality in its final bullet point. Quote, the investment commitment is subject to final due diligence and approval by the CIB's board, unquote. 11 months after the announcement, the Infrastructure Bank's board still had not approved the huge investment and no money has flowed. The bank is answering questions about its evaluation process by referring reporters to an evaluation of the Erie Connector project that's being carried out, not by the feds, but by a succession of Conservative provincial energy ministers who have been asking the project's proponents hard questions about the impact it could have on greenhouse gas emissions in the province. Independent analysts and climate activists have had similar questions since the beginning. They're convinced Ontario will struggle to meet its own electricity needs in the next several years, that it won't have surplus energy to send to the US, and that to cover the cost of building the Erie Connector by generating new energy for the purpose of shipping it south, the province would have to rely overwhelmingly on gas plants instead of cleaner energy sources. Mark S. Winfield, the co-chair of York University's Sustainable Energy Initiative, told The Logic, the Infrastructure Bank seems, quote, remarkably clueless about the electricity decision-making process and system in Ontario, end quote. The Canada Infrastructure Bank's potential investment in the Erie Connector comes down to a perfect marriage between a highly motivated investor and a stalled project. By the spring of 2021, the bank was facing substantial and public pressure to make new investments. That pressure had been building for almost 5 years. Bill Morneau, Justin Trudeau's first finance minister, announced the creation of the bank in November 2016. It would be a centerpiece of the Trudeau government's growth strategy, an absolute massive fund, $35 billion, with a 10-year mandate to seek major institutional investors as partners in transformative, quote, transformative projects, end quote. Once they got into the habit of following the bank's lead, those investors would multiply the federal effort many times over. Morneau anticipated that each dollar of federal investment could leverage as much as $11 from deep-pocketed institutional investors such as other countries' pension funds. Dominic Barton, the prominent consultant who had helped conceive the Infrastructure Bank project as head of Trudeau's Volunteer Advisory Council on Economic Growth, told one interviewer in 2017 that the goal was to bankroll really big projects on a scale that could transform the work of a nation. Quote, fewer, bigger is better than many, end quote, Barton said then. He wanted transportation and power transmission projects, quote, that you can see from the moon, maybe, end quote. The moon turned out to be an elusive suitor. Investments from the bank were rare occurrences, and none lured multiples of the bank's investment from institutional investors. Slow progress led to management churn. The bank's first head of investments resigned in 2019 after only 10 months on the job. Veteran Public Service Administrator Michael Sabia became the chair of the bank's board in April 2020, replacing its inaugural chair and leading to the departure of its first CEO, Pierre Lavallee. Sabia in turn left the bank after only 8 months to become the deputy minister at the Department of Finance. It fell to Corey, the bank's CEO since October 2020, to build a, quote, results-focused organization, end quote, as the bank put it in the news release announcing his appointment. As the COVID-19 pandemic dragged on, the bank was saddled with even higher expectations. Now it was to drive a post-pandemic economic recovery. Quote, I've also been clear to Corey and the board that they need to deliver in the first quarter, end quote. McKenna, then the minister responsible for the bank, told The Logic in February 2021. The Erie Connector announcement nearly made that deadline, arriving 2 weeks into April. Part of the mystery here is why the Erie Connector needs a dime of government money. Its developer is ITC, the largest independent electricity transmission firm in the United States. The ITC, in turn, a subsidiary of Fortis, a St. John's holding company with a steady track record of stock growth, 48 consecutive years of increasing dividend payments, and $58 billion in total assets. So the company that's asking for infrastructure bank money is almost as big as 2 infrastructure banks. ITC Corp acquired the rights to the Erie Connector project. This said it was a 10-minute read. I'm not sure how I'm doing, but we're getting there. From the Lake Erie Power Corp in 2014. The project received approval from Canada's National Energy Board in 2017. But then the momentum went right out of it. This is exciting. The trouble is the project has been shopped for 3 years and no one has jumped aboard, the Hamilton Spectator reported in 2019. The paper quoted an ITC executive, quote, there was an excitement a couple of years ago, but it's kind of quiet because it's not built, end quote. There's no necessary scandal in the prospect of the infrastructure bank enabling a private project that had stalled. The bank exists to some extent to tip the balance of decision-making on such projects. In many, quote, in many cases, vital infrastructure projects wait on the sidelines until the risk profile is resolved and the business case for investment by private sector materializes, end quote. Felix Corriveau, the infrastructure bank spokesperson, wrote in response to questions from The Logic. Quote, the private sector in partnership with the CIB can play a role in delivering important infrastructure without, and again, this is CIB messaging, right? Without CIB acting as a catalyst for private sector investment, it could mean decades of waiting until the risk and economics are addressed. So here he's talking about essentially the government de-risking private projects that have questionable merit. As with many infrastructure projects, quote, there is a very long payback period for a project like this, end quote, Corriveau wrote. It will take years to build and many more years before the line has paid for itself, end quote. The demand for power across the line will depend on things like the pace of each jurisdiction's energy transition, he added, and their respective economic growth. Quote, these are all risks that the project must absorb. The CIB is in this project to help mitigate those risks, and in doing so, to make it more viable for the operator and more beneficial to Ontarians. The problem is that publicly available modeling suggests Ontario is heading toward a substantial crunch in generating capacity. The province is unlikely to have extra electricity just lying around, and to make extra electricity for an export market, it would need to rely heavily on gas-generated power with its attendant greenhouse gas emissions. The connector would be able to run electricity southward into the US, PJM Consortium's grid, or northward into Ontario. Which way would account for most of the freight? The bank's Corriveau said the, quote, expectation is that, quote, energy will flow from Ontario to PJM over the long term, given that Ontario has a much higher share of lower marginal cost sources of supply, which is typically non-emitting compared to PJM, end quote. Over that longer term, according to the latest annual planning outlook from Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator, IESO, the output of the lowest emitting source of electricity, the province's 3 nuclear generating stations, will be diminished as one is retired and the other 2 refurbished. Meanwhile, Ontario's domestic demand for electricity will see strong growth as the province experiences, quote, an emerging transformation of the economy, end quote, driven by rapid growth in everything from electric vehicles to LRT transit to electric lighting in cannabis grow-ops. The upshot, major challenges to the Trudeau government's hopes of reaching net zero emissions in the energy sector by 2035, Yorks Winfield has written with the University of Ottawa's Colleen Kaiser. That's because energy production on top of current levels will almost entirely come from gas plants. Quote, by the late 2030s, electricity-related greenhouse gas emissions are projected to be 600% above 2017 levels, with the curve continuing upwards from there, end quote, they wrote. Generating extra energy to push through the connector would add to that grim greenhouse gas prospect, said Jack Gibbons, the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Quote, the CIB should not be using taxpayer dollars to subsidize increased gas-fired electricity generation and GHG pollution in Ontario, end quote. One of the most surprising parts of this saga is that when asked about its due diligence on the Erie Connector file, the bank replied with reference to an evaluation the Ontario government is carrying out. Quote, we expect to reach financial close once the discussions between ITC and the IESO have been completed, end quote, Corriveau said. To their credit, Ontario's energy ministers have spent months urging the IESO to give the connector project's tires a good hard kick. In a May 2021 letter to the IESO, then Minister Greg Rickford asked it to report back to him on, quote, the potential domestic and global greenhouse gas impacts of any electricity imports and exports through this transmission line, end quote. If ITC couldn't come up with a model that provides, quote, sufficient value to taxpayers, the connector project would, quote, or the connector project, quote, would not proceed to contract execution, Rickford wrote. The IESO's responses to the minister aren't public, but in a January 26, 2022 letter to the IESO, Rickford's successor, Todd Smith, said he is permitting the connector project to proceed to another final round of evaluation. Smith sounds encouraged by what he's heard to date. The project has many potential benefits to Ontario, including improved system reliability, the creation of new opportunities to sell Ontario's surplus electricity to the benefit of Ontario ratepayers by lowering electricity costs, and a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, end quote. He has asked the IESO for a fresh assessment of the, quote, project's value to taxpayers or to ratepayers and the IESO's level of certainty in the value proposition. That report to Smith is due tomorrow, March 22nd. Again, this is 2022. Based on the answer he gets, Smith might approve construction of the Erie Connector, which would in turn apparently trigger the $655 million infrastructure bank investment. What drives Gibbons at the Ontario Clean Air Alliance up the wall is that all of this discussion of a 117-kilometer electricity link under the Great Lakes, or under a Great Lake, ignores the possibility of a simpler solution to power sharing in a low-carbon future, linking to Quebec's power grid, which runs mostly on nearly zero-carbon hydroelectricity. Such connections would make 7,500 megawatts of Quebec hydro available in Ontario at less than half the price Ontario pays for its nuclear-generated electricity, the group argues. Perhaps it's time to sum up and to suggest a path forward. And this is where I think folks will find this interesting. We have two governments making decisions in processes of limited transparency about an international energy link proposed by a subsidiary of one of the richest and soundest companies in Canada. Credible experts worry that the Erie Connector would drive up carbon emissions in Ontario. Independent analysts wonder why governments wouldn't prefer a made-in-Canada solution that is cheaper and would tend to reduce emissions. All of this is the sort of thing that a committee of the House of Commons might reasonably want to investigate. In a minority parliament, opposition parties have all kinds of latitude to haul a project like this before MPs and ask questions to which the available answers are so far limited. The Environment, Natural Resources, and Infrastructure Committees, singly or in combination, could play. MPs could approach the Erie Connector not as a scandal, because there's no reason to suspect it's anything of the sort, but simply as a question about how to make the best choices when allocating substantial government resources in an attempt to build a clean energy future. The Bloc Québécois could investigate the Hydro-Québec alternative. The Conservatives could seek value for money. I would add as an aside, we will also be seeking value for money. The NDP and the Greens, who aren't on the committee, I would add, could keep an eye on the climate implications. And the Liberals, who have always claimed the infrastructure bank was arm's length from government, but whose minister was cheerleading a bank investment before the bank had even decided to make it, could get back into the business of showing an interest in the details of governance. All that's needed is for a few MPs to decide this project is worth their scrutiny. So thanks for your forbearance, Mr. Chair and colleagues. I think that spells out rather clearly, first of all, why the minister should be part of this study, why this study is warranted in the first place, and a few of the lines of inquiry that are very much in the public interest and would be a benefit to Parliament and to all Canadians. And so with that, and I appreciate the ability to read the article in full, I found it very interesting, and I understand that, you know, now we're several years later, but this is still a matter of great interest because the Canada Infrastructure Bank is still out there. And its CEO is still out there trying to find ways to put public money into private infrastructure to help private investors make a private dollar. And as everyone around this table knows, we do not think that that objective is in the public interest, and that's why we have supported the recommendation that has already been put before the House that the Canada Infrastructure Bank be abolished. Either that or substantially reform its objectives so that it works more exclusively in the public interest. And I'll leave it at that. I know we're going to have more opportunities, but I sit at this table and I spend lots of time, as others do, listening to Liberals and Conservatives read from documents and talk out the clock. And I thought today perhaps I would take a turn at adding more substantially to the record than I usually do. So with that, I'll say thank you again and pass it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Monsieur Iacono, suivi par Monsieur Badaway.
Monsieur Iacono and then Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
To adjourn.
Merci, Monsieur Iacono. Je vais passer la parole à Greffière.
Juste pour clarifier, c'est pour ajourner le meeting, c'est ça?
Thank you. I'll give it the floor to the clerk. It's to adjourn the meeting.
Mr. Baraway? Monsieur Iacono?
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis?
Oui.
Mr. O'Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers?
He's been having issues with his.
Yes, sorry.
Mr. Stroll?
No.
Mr. Muse?
No.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval?
No.
Mr. Backrack?
No.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
Motion to adjourn is not carried. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess maybe a motion to adjourn was not appropriate with respect to the intent that we have, at least I have. I'm more than interested in continuing this discussion. However, I have a schedule to abide by today, including getting into the House. But I don't want to finish this discussion. I think this discussion warrants a lot more thought, a lot more time. So with that, Mr. Chair, there is a difference between adjourning and suspending. And I feel that instead of adjourning, that I'll put a motion forward to suspend. That difference being that when we come back for the next meeting, we're not starting from scratch. We're actually just going to continue the discussion that we're actually having while giving the respect to each individual's schedules for the day. So I'll put that motion forward to, in fact, suspend.
11.
Correct. Okay. Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Okay, do we have unanimous consent to suspend? It would be until Tuesday. Okay. See no objection. This meeting stands suspended until Tuesday at 11 a.m.